In 1987, a man named Zhengfei sat in a cramped apartment in Shenzhen, China, staring at a table covered in circuit boards and tangled wires. He was without any powerful investors, with no Western education, only about $5,000 and a vision to make China independent in telecommunications. At the time, the very idea seemed laughable. Ericsson, Nokia, and Motorola all dominated the industry, and China was at least, believe it or not, 20 years behind in technology. No one could have believed that a small startup from a developing country could ever take on the giants of the West. But Ren wasn't just an ordinary entrepreneur. As a former military engineer, he had seen China's dangerous reliance on foreign technology. He knew that if the country ever found itself in conflict with the West, its entire communication system could be cut off overnight. So he made a decision. Huawei would change that. And so it goes. What started in a tiny apartment would grow into the largest telecom company in the world, until it became the target of the most powerful government on earth. This is the incredible rise and the shocking fall of Huawei. The China of the late 1980s was not the economic powerhouse we know today. It was still shaking off the shadows of Mao's rule, struggling to catch up with the rest of the world. Foreign companies controlled almost every major industry, especially telecommunications. At the time, China imported nearly all its telecom equipment from Western companies. Every phone call, every switchboard, every piece of communication infrastructure was powered by foreign technology. Ren Zhengfei saw the danger and started a small company, Huawei. The company began in reselling imported telephone switches to Chinese businesses. But Ren had bigger ambitions. Instead of just selling equipment, Huawei would build its own technology. By the early 1990s, Huawei had developed its first major product, the CNC08 switch. It wasn't entirely revolutionary, but it was China-made, and that what mattered. Then in 1996, the Chinese government made a game-changing decision. It banned foreign companies from providing telecom equipment to rural areas. Suddenly, Huawei had made an entire market all to itself. Within a few years, Huawei became the dominant telecom provider in China. But Ren knew that true power wasn't just in China, it was in the world. And so, Huawei set its sight on global domination. By the early 2000s, Huawei had mastered the Chinese market. But outside of China, few had heard of the name. Western firms laughed at the idea of a Chinese company competing in the telecom industry. They dismissed Huawei as a copycat, incapable of innovation. Little did they know, Huawei will prove them wrong. In 2004, Huawei secured a deal with British Telecom to supply network equipment in the UK. This was a massive victory. For the first time, a major Western company had chosen Huawei over its American and European rivals. Then came 2008, the year Huawei shook the industry. The company won more 3G network contracts than any other competitor, beating Nokia, Ericsson, and Alcatel, who never even considered Huawei as a competitor of theirs. By 2010, Huawei was no longer a Chinese underdog. It was the second largest telecom equipment provider in the world, just behind Ericsson. Huawei was winning because it was different. It was cheaper than Western competitors. It was also faster in rolling out networks and more flexible in meeting customer needs. The West had underestimated Huawei, and now it was too late to stop its rise. Or so it seemed. Telecom networks were just the first step. Now Huawei wanted something bigger, an industry that was just rising at the first decade of the 2000s, the smartphone industry. At the time, Apple and Samsung ruled the market. Chinese brands were seen as cheap knockoffs unable to compete with iPhone or Samsung. As usual, Huawei set out to change that narrative. The company's first real attempt at a premium smartphone came in 2011 when it launched the Ascend series. Apparently, it was Huawei's way of saying we're not just a budget brand, we can compete at the top. The phones themselves weren't groundbreaking, but they were well-built and affordable, catching the attention of international markets. By 2012, Huawei had already climbed to the third largest smartphone maker in the world, just behind Samsung and Apple. But it wasn't enough. Huawei didn't just want market share, it wanted respect. Thus, the 2016 bold move when Huawei took a step forward with the P9 series, introducing the world's first dual camera system developed in collaboration with Leica, a German company that specializes in manufacturing cameras and optical lenses. For the first time in the company's history, the phone's camera was leagues ahead of the competition, and suddenly, Huawei was being recognized not just as a manufacturer, but as an innovator. But Huawei's most impressive achievement came in 2018 when it launched the Mate 20 Pro, the first smartphone in the world to feature a 7nm processor, beating Apple to the punch. It was a solid statement from Huawei that they weren't just competing anymore, they were leading the industry. But Huawei's biggest weapon wasn't smartphones. It was 5G, the next leap in cellular network technology. By 2018, Huawei was no longer just China's tech champion, it was the undisputed leader in 5G technology. The company had spent over $15 billion a year on research and development, securing over 60 international 5G contracts, and its equipment was already being used by major telecom providers across Europe, Asia, and Africa. For the first time, a Chinese company was setting the global standard for a technology that would define the next decade. Faster internet, smart cities, self-driving cars, and artificial intelligence all depended on 5G technology. However, in Washington, Huawei's dominance wasn't seen as a triumph of innovation. It was seen as a direct threat to the US national security. For years, US intelligence agencies had been suspicious of Huawei. Since Ren, the founder, had once served as an engineer in the People's Liberation Army, the US government feared that Huawei's technology could be used by the Chinese Communist Party to conduct espionage. The core accusation was simple. If Huawei controlled the world's 5G networks, the Chinese government could intercept global communications, spy on foreign governments, and even shut down infrastructure during conflicts. There was, however, no concrete public evidence to prove Huawei was actually spying. But in geopolitics, perception is often more powerful than proof. Subsequently, on December 1, 2018, a shocking event escalated the tensions. Min Wangzhou, Huawei CFO and Ren Zhengfei's daughter, was arrested in Canada at the request of the US Department of Justice. She was accused of violating US sanctions on Iran by using Huawei subsidiary Skycom to secretly do business with Iran while misleading American banks. China was outraged, calling the arrest politically motivated. Huawei denied the charges, but the message was clear. The US was making its move against Huawei. Just a few months later, in May 2019, the US government blacklisted Huawei, placing it on the Entity List, which banned US companies from selling technology to Huawei without special government approval. For Huawei, this was catastrophic. You see, Huawei's smartphones relied entirely on Google's Android operating system. But under the new US restrictions, Google was forced to cut ties with Huawei, which meant no Google Play Store, no Gmail, no Google Maps or YouTube, no access to critical Android updates. For consumers outside of China, this was a deal breaker. A Huawei phone without Google services was practically useless. Almost overnight, Huawei's smartphone sales began to plummet internationally. But the biggest blow came in 2020. The US escalated its attack by cutting off Huawei's access to semiconductors, the tiny chips that power everything from smartphones to 5G base stations. The US pressured TSMC, the world's leading chipmaker, to stop producing Huawei's Kirin chips, as well as American companies like Qualcomm and Intel were banned from selling chips to Huawei. Without Google services, Huawei could still survive in China, but without advanced chips, its entire hardware business was at risk. Huawei tried to stockpile semiconductors before the ban took full effect, but it was a losing battle. By the end of 2020, Huawei was forced to sell off its Honor smartphone brand just to keep part of its business alive. Of course, the US didn't just stop at banning Huawei within its borders. It launched a global campaign to convince its allies to do the same. One by one, countries started blocking Huawei from their 5G networks. Australia, first country to ban Huawei from its 5G network, followed by Japan, which banned Huawei and ZTE from government contracts. And then came in United Kingdom, which initially allowed Huawei in its 5G networks but later reserved the decision under US pressure. Canada officially banning Huawei from 5G infrastructure. However, not everyone followed the US. Though Germany, France, and some other European countries allowed limited use of Huawei's 5G equipment, but with strict security controls. In 2019, Huawei had been on top of the world. Its smartphone sales even briefly overtook Samsung, making it the '1 smartphone brand globally. By 2021, everything had changed. Huawei's smartphone sales collapsed by over 80%, 5G contracts all dried up, and the company went from being a global tech powerhouse to fighting for its own survival. However, Huawei wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Instead of surrendering, it made a bold decision. If it couldn't rely on the West, it would build its own future. Determined to stay relevant, Huawei developed its own operating system, Harmony OS, to replace Android. It also began producing its own Kirin chips, a shocking comeback that defied US sanctions. Beyond smartphones, Huawei pivoted to new industries: AI, cloud computing, and electric vehicles, trying to rebuild its empire in other ways. Today, Huawei is no longer the unstoppable force it once was, but it's still standing. The battle isn't just about Huawei, it's about China versus the US, technology versus politics, and who will control the future of the digital world. Now, was Huawei truly a threat to global security, or was it simply a victim of US politics? Would you still buy a Huawei phone today, or do you think the US was right to shut it down? Let us know in the comments. Give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel.